Oh, lights. All right. Wow, is it Friday already? I both can't believe it's September 19th because it's come so quickly, and I can't believe it's only September 19th somehow. At the same time, those two things linger in my mind. Okay, so today, my very pure and true hope is to finish up talking about our generations, right? We were talking about millennials last time, kind of moving through the millennials. And then hopefully we can get into Gen Z today and get through a good chunk of it. Maybe finish it today, maybe finish it on Monday. And then move on, to our next topic after that. Okay. Oops, that's one more forward. So we ended off on this slide, right? We were talking about our different generational cohorts and sort of their attitudes towards religion. Now, I will say, if you want to learn a whole ton more about this topic, I'm teaching a class in the winter. It's already full, but I'm sure spaces will open up in it, which is Sociology of Religion, where I go into quite a bit of this. So, I have lots more detail. This is like the barest of bare detail in terms of what we're looking at in terms of youth and religion. I'll talk about it more in that class. Okay. However, we ended off with this slide, and then I'm going to move on to some kind of interesting cultural attitudes that the millennials brought to bear, and I'll tell you where I got that data. And then we'll talk about Gen Z. Okay. So when it comes to our religious kind of landscape for the millennials, right? What you see again is they are much less religious than the generations prior, right? So we got our silence boomers and Gen Xers, in these various shades of gray, all, more likely to pray, believe in God, or attend religious services than millennials, right? And, ever pray is even lower for Gen Z, according to this data coming out of the General Social Survey in 2018. Okay, so fun stuff. All right, so in terms of kind of cultural attitudes, and what are the millennials like? Like, what was their framework? Oh, I'll tell you, this stuff all comes out of this big longitudinal study. Oops, I wrote that wrong. The National Study of Youth and Religion, which was done at University of Notre Dame, right in Indiana. That at that particular research university, they have the great privilege of having what I think is one of the absolute best sociologists in the world, a guy named Christian Smith. And he ran this huge project kind of starting in 2002 and running till 2015 to kind of track, the religious lives of American teenagers from the time they were between 13 and 18 until they were basically, rounding into their 30s. So what's really, really super interesting about this particular study is that it picked up a lot of other, so these are the millennials, right? The whole cohort, they're all millennials, and they picked up a whole bunch of information. They surveyed 3,000 of them in the first wave, and then smaller amounts in the subsequent waves because you have a kind of attrition in the sample. But you picked up a whole bunch of really interesting information about the millennials when they were young. So what were the millennials like when they were young? Well, one of the dominant characteristics, according to Smith and one of his co-authors, Patricia Snell, was that they were a pretty cheery generation in lots of ways, right? Optimistic, like very, very optimistic. They come with a lot of optimism in all of the stuff they kind of think about the future. So Smith and Snell said, and this is in a book called Lives in Transition, that, the millennials, for what it's worth, were very focused on the future, and that future was very bright. As they're entering emerging adulthood, they're struggling with a bunch of stuff, and they were sort of like, yeah, we know we're not where we want to be, but they thought that they would get there, right? And as we saw with some of that data from Twenge that I talked about last class, by the time they're rounding into their 30s and 40s, the millennials are largely there, right? They've caught up in terms of wealth, they haven't caught up in terms of wealth, but they've caught up in terms of earning, and they're making major gains in terms of catching up in wealth to the other generations, right? Owing largely to how educated they are. Now, for some minority of the sample, right, so less typical, but still a significant minority, they knew that optimism was the typical frame for people their age, right, for their generational cohort, but they themselves were not optimistic. Now, one of the things that Smith and Snell sort of suggest is that it's not that the millennials kind of had a really easy life, right? The millennials, like every generation, have had their shares of bumps and bruises, right? They've lived through lots of them. Family breakdowns, right? Their parents getting divorced, lots of drug use by their parents, right? We saw with the baby boomers, we had all those deaths of despair, right? As they're moving through their 40s and 50s. And that's, the parents of the millennials to a large extent. So they're seeing a lot of bumps and bruises from that. Death of friends and family members from drug overdoses and other causes, accidents. Some of them face racism, discrimination, all sorts of things, right? As they're rounding into emerging adulthood, right? They've had relationship failures. They've had relationship betrayals, right? Friends and romantic partners betray them. Professional setbacks, right? They go to college, they drop out. They go back for something else. It's especially true for young men. They fail. They try a career. They fail at that career. They move out of their parents' house to go to college. They move back into their parents' homes after college or once they sort of flounder out of the system. So they struggle in lots of ways, and yet that framework of general optimism really holds for the millennials. Oh, did I? Okay. So I thought I had updated the PDF because I did actually take out a bunch of stuff for the millennials because, and sorry, I thought I had updated the slideshow and maybe I only thought I did, or sometimes the old PDF or the old documents linger on the, Canvas page. I shortened it because I was, the whole generations thing was taking 3 weeks. And I didn't want it to take 3 weeks. So yes, if there are slides that I'm not talking about, I've sort of condensed it. I've kind of condensed it. Will we be going over more of the exam details and what to expect? If so, when? The class before the exam. So I don't remember when the exam is. I'll have to look it up. But the class before the exam, we will do that. I promise. Okay. Sorry I left those slides in. I thought I had deleted all of that. Maybe it's one of those things where I went to do it and then I looked at Canvas and Canvas distracted me with all of its shiny goodness. So I'm sorry that if those slides are back in there. I will make sure to update that later. Okay. So, regrets. You could sort of take no regrets as sort of millennial cri de coeur, if you will, or battle cry, right? So, millennials are very forward-looking, right? They tend to look at the future and how this manifests in their relationships to their own lives and things that have happened is, things that happened in the past are in the past. They don't weigh them down, right? And I think really clear here, even when they admitted they were responsible for things that happened to them, they didn't dwell on them. They learned their lessons from the past and moved on. They admit, or Smith observes that they seem to, sorry, that should be think. That's a typo. I need to fix that. They seem to think admitting having regrets was the equivalent to capitulating to self-doubt, and that no regrets, right? Their kind of attitude towards the past is as follows, right? And this is kind of a great way to sum it up. The whole core of the millennial experience, right, is being who you are or discovering who you are, right? And so anything that happens in the past, right, is always framed as helping you become who you are, who you were meant to be. I have a friend, and I like to tease my friends a little bit, and she got tattooed on her shoulder, everything happens for a reason. And I was like, everything? Let's talk about that. No, but it's this. I think it's just funny, because Lexi's great great lady, really like her. But I think it's a kind of a funny statement, but it's a very millennial statement, right? It's like everything happens for a reason, and in a lot of cases what that reason is to help you become who you are, right? It shapes you. And so having regrets for those things, would be a kind of ingratitude towards who you've become, right? And I remember talking to another one of my friends, who's a year younger than me, and just having this conversation, and she's like, yeah, I have no regrets about my life. I'm like, not even one? Like, not one regret? Like, you really wish you'd tried Crystal Pepsi when it was still around? Like, like, not one thing you regret at all? I have fond memories of Crystal Pepsi from my childhood. And so, anyway, and it always struck me as kind of a really, weird thing. And I'm like, I have a ton of regrets. I don't dwell on them either, but I do think like this, like, we have no regrets, right? I do hear this a lot in my cohort, and I find it a very odd kind of philosophy. But then I'm a very odd kind of person. Okay, here's something really critical about the millennials. When we talk about their view of the world, right? And I have this here. This graphic matters. I'm going to put a little box around it because it's super important. I'm going to point a bunch of arrows at it as well. So, if you're paying attention, you'll realize that this term, it's not just a fun graphic I put on there to make the slide slightly more colorful. It has a very important meaning. We talk about their moral philosophy and their world view. Millennials, and this carries forward to Gen Z as well, basically don't believe in the possibility of objective truth, right? So what is truth? Truth is subjective, right? So they view themselves typically as being limited to their own perspective and their own subjective selves, right? So a very typical kind of phrasing for millennials is, well, it might be true for you, but it's not true for me, right? That might be your truth, not my truth, right? So this whole idea of, let's say my truth is a very millennial idea. So if you ever use that phrase, if you've ever heard that phrase, you can thank the millennials for adding that to the English lexicon. For good or for ill, it is a very millennial way of thinking, right? So all right, how do Smith and Snell put this? And I always found their phrasing of this very interesting, right? Let me cover these points, and then I'll tell you what it is. Okay, so millennials are not even sure what objective truth is, or if it can be discovered. And I always like this point of the book when they're interviewers, right? So as part of the National Study of Youth and Religion, they surveyed 3,000 people in the first wave and then smaller amounts in the subsequent waves, and then interviewed 300 to about 250 people in each of the subsequent waves of the study, and there are 4 waves of it. And one of the things in this second wave where this data comes out of is they had their interviewers asking them questions about, whether morality was based on objective or universal qualities, or simply a relative human invention. And what they said is that many, if not most, could not understand what the interviews were trying to ask, right? And essentially, what they couldn't understand was the notion of objective or universal qualities, right? That the idea that morality would be based on, some kind of basic principles, right? Some foundational principles of the moral order, right? Whether that be God or natural law, or any other, some kind of code written into the universe, whatever it happens to be, this was a very foreign concept to the millennials. Okay, so what did they say about it? And I've always liked it. So they say, oops, that's still on my highlighter. That's not gonna work. Despite most of them having never read Nietzsche, Foucault, or Derrida, they have deeply imbibed the philosophy of postmodern thinkers, right? So all of these folks, I mean, Nietzsche is a 19th century philosopher, semi-mad, but in a lot of ways, Nietzsche's philosophy has informed the postmodern movement that starts in kind of the 1960s, that really takes hold, I guess, after the 1960s, and views, truth as nothing more than a bunch of power games, right? As it being the imposition of, a great Foucauldian definition, like if someone asks you what is power, is your ability, you can answer, this is a good sociological answer, your ability to impose your subjectivity on someone else, right? That's a kind of Nietzschean, Foucauldian, and Derridian kind of way of thinking about power. And most of the millennials, they say, and I would say they're right here, have deeply sort of absorbed this belief about what truth is and where morality comes from, right? Without ever having read any of these things. So those postmodern philosophers have sort of trickled down into popular consciousness and become the sort of normal grammar that people operate in without even really knowing what that is. I'm sure there are no questions about that. I'm glad there aren't. Okay. So, that same quote that I had there. So it seems they cannot, for whatever reason, believe in or sometimes even conceive of a given objective truth, fact, reality, or nature of the world that is independent of their subjective self-experience and in relation to which they and others might learn or be persuaded to change, right? I love Smith. Smith is a great sociologist. I got a couple of books out that are more recent, like What is a Person, that are really interesting. And at some point I might build something around those in terms of course content. But it's really kind of interesting quote, right? That our millennials can't, for whatever reason, believe in or conceive of an objective truth, fact, or reality, or nature that is independent of their subjective self-experience and that might force them to do something, might learn or be persuaded to change their behavior in some way. So they're deeply postmodern and they're deeply subjectivist, right? Okay, now that said, that doesn't mean that, millennials are like these amoral monsters. They do have a morality. It's just the basis of it is kind of weird, right? In the sense that it's not very anchored. All right, so what did millennials think about right and wrong? Okay, well, they thought it's pretty easy to figure out what's right and wrong, right? Despite lacking an objective standard, right? Morality for them was basically common sense. And how do you figure it out? I'm going to highlight this one as well. They know morality by attending to their subjective feelings or intuitions within themselves. So, what's right? Well, how does it feel, right? Does it feel like you're doing something right, or does it feel like you're doing something wrong? And obviously, this has real-world impacts, right? Because your morality then, and judging other people's morality, will largely come in how it makes you feel, right? Is what this person is arguing for moral or immoral? Well, how does it make you feel, right? If it makes you feel bad, potentially that is an immoral kind of argument or position, right? Because it's largely down to emotions and feelings, and not for nothing, right? Another thing Smith and Snell suggest about the millennials is that they have largely replaced statements that start with "I think," ... for statements that start with "I feel," ... right? So they fill that in with whatever, right? I think this is right because, no, it's I feel this is right because. I feel I should do this for the following reasons. Okay, and where does that morality come from, those feelings? They think, it was implanted in them when they were children by parents or teachers. So it's socially bound in the sense that it's been passed down to them, right? These shared kind of values by parents or teachers or the media or television, but mostly parents and teachers. Okay, and they view thinking and living morally as relatively effortless, right? It's easy. We'll talk about this when we talk about religion later in the course, because this comes down to their religious philosophy as well. It's easy to be a good person, right? Okay, So what does it mean, right? How do you be a good person? Well, I mean, the first kind of rule is don't do any harm to others, right? Don't hurt people, right? That's a pretty straightforward thing. Now that comes to take on, it starts here. Millennials are pretty robust, in some ways kind of tough when it comes to this, right? In terms of what they conceive of as hurting people. It's more down to the physical, in the sense that it's emotional. It would be like, well, don't cheat on your girlfriend, or boyfriend or significant other or whatever, right? Don't do crappy things like that. Don't steal, don't harm people. Actually, once we get to Gen Z, it comes to take on a different kind of connotation, right? And Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff have documented this in a book that's called The Coddling of the American Mind. With Gen Z, ideas you don't agree with start to have this harmful quality, right? That basically, violence, words can be violence. That only comes with Gen Z. And they document, in The Coddling of the American Mind, when this kind of came to American campuses and the shift they saw. Millennials were okay with kind of robust debate. Gen Z largely is not, at least on American campuses. Okay, so, and I will say, like, neither Haidt or Lukianov is a person of, this is not conservative whining. I would say both of them are kind of left-leaning. Certainly Haidt is. I don't know Lukianov as well. Okay, now, in terms of morality, millennials are what we would call, and again, let's highlight this term, they are moral consequentialists. That's an eraser, that didn't work. Is the screen getting smaller or are my fingers getting fatter? I don't know. Okay, that's still an eraser. Come on, Broussard. Okay, the pen. So they are moral consequentialists. What does that mean? So, what it means is, how do you judge a moral, like whether a behavior is moral or not? Well, it depends on the consequences. Right, now this is distinguished from other forms of ethics, bless you. Things that you would call things like duty-based ethics, right? Duty-based ethics, virtue ethics, deontological or deontology, which is like, okay, so duty-based ethics is basically like, okay, there's a broader duty, either to your society or to a cosmic being, right? So like, why should you do, any particular action? Well, you have a duty to, the creator of the universe, or you have a duty to your society, right? You should be patriotic to your country because you have a duty to them. That's what you would call duty-based ethics. It's based in a sense of an other that sets a sort of moral boundary. Virtue ethics is, you should do the right thing because, essentially, it cultivates good things in you, right? So why should you study when you could cheat? Well, because the second you cheat, you're essentially poisoning your own self, right? And you build a pattern of behavior that's negative. But if you don't cheat, right, you work hard, you build, good habits, good patterns, and that will manifest good things. Deontology is sort of a moral system, and this one's always the one I struggle with defining, that says there are just these basic moral ideas that hang out in the universe and are sort of part of a universal kind of ethics, right? And you can have both theistic and atheistic deontological arguments, but basically it's like, morality is just kind of set. Some things are right and wrong. That's why we know the Nazis did bad things, right? Because we can recognize evil when we see it, because it's written like into our biology by some unknown force. Okay. Moral consequentialism, and you'll see it's sort of cousin instrumental ethics, right? What's the other one? Utilitarian ethics, right? These kind of go together, but they're worried more about the consequences of a particular action. So, an action is only immoral if it hurts someone else. So, it might not be bad to cheat on a test, right? So maybe in this class, right, would it be okay to cheat on a test? Well, for a moral consequentialist, why not? All that's going to happen if you cheat on the test in this class is you're going to get a higher grade, right? It's not on a curve. So you're cheating, and you get an A+, it doesn't mean that now I have to curve the averages down and, the people who tried to do their own work but got a B, their grade gets reduced. No one's harmed by you getting an A+ in this class by going on and using, Claude or ChatGPT or whatever to answer your questions. So it's not wrong, right? It's fine. It might not be immoral because it doesn't really hurt anyone, right? You benefit, no one is harmed. So you judge it on that, right? Is it wrong to steal? Well, in moral consequentialism, maybe not, right? So let's say you go and it's 2 a.m, you don't have the money to buy your case of beer for that party you're going to, so instead you just walk out of it. That liquor store is insured, right? They have insurance. So is it wrong to steal from them? They're going to be made whole and you get a case of beer. Win-win? Not really, obviously. For the liquor store, it's a bad thing. I'm not making the case that that's true. I'm just illustrating a consequentialist kind of ethics, right? So it might not be immoral to do things. So what ends up happening is moral choices for millennials, and I would argue Gen Z is largely the same, are ad hoc, right? So they are made in the moment. You have to kind of judge every moral situation on what's happening in that particular moment, right? And you have to do this kind of moral calculus for every moral choice. That is a sort of millennial moral consequentialist ethics, right? Now, as you can maybe tell from the examples I've given, not hurting others is a free-floating, unjustified supposition, right? So why is it wrong to hurt others? And it is, and is it always wrong to do harm to others? Are there circumstances where harming others might be morally justified? What Smith and Snell sort of say is millennials don't know, right? They actually can't articulate particularly good reasons why not hurting others is like the core of their morality, right? Why just the idea of harm is core to that moral system. They don't have a philosophical basis for it, so it's not thought through. But it's just common sense, right? That harming other people is bad. Okay, I know you're probably tired of me talking about millennial morality. So some referred to things like karma as a reason not to do bad things, right? But this is a very pop culture form of karma, right? This wouldn't be like what you would find in Hinduism or Buddhism. It's more this idea that, what goes around comes around. Put good things out in the universe, good things happen. Put bad things out in the universe, bad things happen, right? So, basically, karma's a bitch. If you do bad things, eventually it's going to catch up with you. So this is the sort of way some of them think. But again, it's not really a developed philosophical notion with like a metaphysical basis. It just kind of floats there, right? Do good, good things will happen. Do bad, bad things will happen, right? Be honest, you'll be treated honestly. Apparently, no one has ever been to a car dealership. Okay. Do we not go over Gen Alpha because there's not enough research on them as a generation? Yeah, I mean, basically, if I have time over the weekend, I have a little bit of stuff on Gen Alpha, which I just haven't been able to read properly and incorporate. So if we have a little bit of extra time, or I have a little bit of extra time, I will try to put it, I'll try to put it in. But yeah, we're not, like so far, right, our Gen Alphas, oh, how old are they? The start year is 2011, right? So they're still kind of just entering adolescence. So we don't know much, right? Because social science data, polling especially, like in surveys, we're not really going to see until a good chunk of them start to like be 18, 19, 20, 21, right? Once they enter there, we should start getting like, but that's, probably still 4 years away until really the first ones come into a lot of our social science samples. So, because you don't tend to poll children a lot. You might see some of it start to show up in monitoring the future, I guess this year, because the 8th graders in monitoring the future will be the first wave of Gen Alpha. But yeah, we don't have a ton of you don't have a ton of data on them yet. I would say what we do have is pretty low resolution. So I don't want to talk about it much. Do I think millennial morality and no regrets exist because religion is less prominent? I think that's not an insane, whoops, what happened there? Not an insane kind of assumption. I do think there's more going on, right? I certainly think like religion's loss of relevance is an important aspect of that, especially to the kind of objective standard, right? Whether morality is objective or not. I think that is, the idea of an objective morality is a very religious kind of framing, especially in a kind of, Christian sort of worldview, and I guess Jewish and Islamic worldview as well. So I do think that plays a role, but I also think, that some of the, shall we say, some of the ideas that started in academia in the 1960s, right, postmodernism particularly, and the kind of dissemination of especially Friedrich Nietzsche's kind of belief system has played a major role in that as well. And so much so that it's now just part, again, most of you will never have read Nietzsche. Well, a lot of you will go through life never reading Nietzsche, and yet you live in Nietzschean kind of waters in a lot of cases, right? You deeply have imbibed sort of Nietzschean thought without even knowing it, because it's been so dispersed, through academics, and then people who've been to university, just kind of spreading it out in the culture, and then into media and all of these sorts of places. Would I say that a good example of moral imperatives is a divided consensus on Kirk's assassination? I mean, I do think in the sense that, people can't agree that just him being murdered is wrong. I don't think this is a new problem. I think, and people have always been like, well, is it good or bad that Julius Caesar was murdered, right? It depends who you talk to. So Kirk, I'm not comparing Kirk to Caesar. Caesar was considerably more brutal and more successful than Charlie Kirk. He murdered 1 million Gauls and enslaved another 1 million Gauls on his way to becoming, the first emperor of Rome. I don't know that Charlie Kirk slaughtered or enslaved 1 million of anything, except YouTube clicks. But yeah, I think definitely there is this divided kind of consensus, even over whether murdering this person is kind of justified, speaks to that consequentialism. And I think that kind of free-floating harm assumption, we don't really know what it means. Again, I think it distills down to Gen Z in a particular way that's a little bit different. Allowed it at the time, get fired, get hired somewhere else. I would say moral relativists. I don't think Platonists make sense, but it's been a while since I read Plato, so maybe I'm wrong. Okay, this is another question, like, was it super special to be a millennial? And yes, it was. It rocked to be a millennial, especially the older cohort. Back to the regret slide. Is it possible they had less regret because the state of the world allowed it at the time, get fired, get hired elsewhere? Maybe. I think this largely, though, goes down to the parenting philosophy, right? The millennials were parented through this end of the kind of, well, maybe not the end, but the apogee at the time of this kind of self-help, you're super special and wonderful, discovering who you are, right? All that stuff we talked about in the baby boomers, and then with Gen X, right? All that self-help stuff, it finds a sort of culmination in the millennials, right? Where you are the most specialist, super special being that ever existed. You are perfect just the way you are. So anything that made you that way must be a good thing, right? You got fired from that job for stealing from the cash register. Well, everything happens for a reason, guys. Again, I say this slightly glibly because I hate that phrase. When I had a friend who died of a drug overdose, and it was one of my best friends, and someone said, everything happens for a reason, and I just about decked them. I was just like, okay, I'm having a little trouble seeing the reason for the drug overdose, leaving his 2 kids without a father, but sure, everything happens for a reason. And I was like, yes, how lovely. Thank you for that perfectly sane sentiment. Did the Holocaust happen for a reason? Let's have a moral discussion before I beat you to death. No, I do not promote philosophical violence any more than political violence. But, I find it a funny phrasing, and sometimes I hear that, in the midst of tragedy, everything happens for a reason, and I want to hit my head against the wall. Because I'm like, that makes no sense. Please stop saying that. Especially to people who just lost a loved one. That's like the worst thing you can say. But yeah, I do think it's just part of this, like, everything made you who you are, and that's all that matters, right? Because finding your authentic self is at the core of the millennial experience. I wish my authentic self had more hair. Anyway. And it didn't involve me flying to Turkey for painful hair implantation surgery. Okay, anyway. Gotta lighten the mood occasionally. Right, so the millennials, right? They are relativists, relativism. It's a deep relativism. What is right and what is wrong? Well, everybody's different, but for me, right, very common kind of millennial phraseology. Nobody can impose or presume the perspective of another person, right? This is my truth rather than the truth. It's my truth. And every individual is different, so everybody has to decide morality for him or herself, right? So there is no set morality. You have to figure it out on your own. Right, okay, so I've got my morality is framed in subjective terms, right? I feel that. And according to Smith and Snell, broadly when we talk about our millennials, they're social constructionists, right? And again, this is not because they've carefully read their Peter Berger, right? They've not, read like Berger and Luckman's The Social Construction of Reality and imbibed that philosophy deeply. It's just in the air, right? It's just floating around them. So they believe the social world is changeable, right? And lots of aspects of the social world are socially constructed, right? So when you hear this phrase, again, that's the philosophy. So things like gender roles, sexuality, all sorts of things are socially constructed, right? Even institutional norms, cultural norms, they're all relative and socially constructed. So you can't really say yours are any better than someone else, right? So you end up in a pretty deep cultural relativism where all cultures are seen essentially as equivalent, right? They're all just different paths up the same mountain of human experience, right? And so this manifests in sort of, ideas of really deep ideas of multiculturalism, right? Because all cultures are essentially kind of similar, right? It's all relative and there's no culture that's better than another for the millennials. Okay, I'm just wondering if I have any other questions. Oh, I'll tell you exactly what's on the exam. Don't worry about it. And I don't surprise people with content we didn't cover. So you're fine. I will only test you on things we talked about. I promise. Okay. So relationships for millennials, and we talk about sex and sexuality later on in the course. A lot of this will come up again. The millennials, getting married a lot later than their parents did. They start to move marriage and starting families late 20s, early 30s. That's pretty normal. And what is youth, right? The whole point of this class. It's a time to try things, find your passions, travel, and secure yourself as an individual, right? So, who are you? Who is your authentic self? Well, that's what you figure out when you're young. Okay. And only once that process is done, or at least well underway, can you think about settling down, right? So career stability, income come before children, marriage, and children. Here I'll hint at something I'll talk about later. We could call this a capstone model, right? But again, we'll get to that later on. Okay, now, millennials, probably more so than any prior generation, are a generation for whom relationship norms are amorphous, right? So you get this sort of detached status in relationships that starts with millennials. And so you see the rise of, and really the dominance in millennials, of hookup culture and indeterminate relationship statuses, right? So in the past, right, if you were to say the silence, your progression through relationships was very set, right? And it was based on these very well understood cultural scripts, right? So you would meet someone, right? You would first, be courting, then you would go steady, and then maybe you would give them your PIN, right? Not your bank PIN, that didn't happen at the time. It was actually a physical PIN that especially males got. So you would pin them, right? So if you ever watch a movie from the 50s or that's set in the 50s, you'll hear about that. And then, you would probably marry them after that point or break up. But it was a very clear path, and you would every relationship proceeded in the same way. It gets less and less definite as we move from the boomers to Gen X to millennials. And by the time you get to the millennials, it's all over the place, right? There is no cultural script anymore as to what it means. So you get a sort of explosion of vocabulary to talk about relationships. You get friends with benefits, hanging out, dating, semi-cohabiting, living together apart, and all of this explosion of terms that happens. No one really knows where they are in the relationship. At a certain point, no one knows, am I actually dating this person? Like, we've hooked up a bunch of times, so what is the actual thing? So you have things like the define the relationship talk, and all of that fun stuff. And hooking up becomes the normal way you sort of enter relationships, right? And it's very, very common for the millennials, and it's defined very broadly. But again, we'll cover that later in the course. Okay. Some people argued that millennials, sort of represented the end of marriage as an institution because they did it so late, and it tended to be sort of that last step or capstone of their relationship system, right? And living together, especially cohabiting, became really, really normal for the millennials. It was much rarer in previous generations. Largely, it seems because it was viewed as a sort of safety mechanism. If you lived with someone, you could test the relationship to avoid relationship breakdown when it really got serious. Okay. Like I said, I have way too much on the millennials. Maybe we are the narcissist generation, and I just like talking about us. I promise I won't talk about millennials the whole course. All right, so in terms of kind of, attitudes towards consumerism, generally speaking, millennials are a kind of funny generation in the sense that they love consumerism, right? I guess everybody loves consumerism, but consumerism and consumer culture are the world they expect to live in, and living a good life means having stuff, right? The one who wins is the one who dies with most stuff. That would be a pretty normal millennial sort of view. And is it moral to buy stuff? As long as you can afford it, it's fine, right? So owning more than other people, well, as long as you can afford it, that's fine, right? You don't really have an obligation to share any of your excess wealth with anybody else. It's your money, you do what you want with it. Okay, less commonly, a kind of notion of the common good. We should take care of each other, but like relationships, things like volunteering, donating, actually helping people was something they figured they would do much later in life, and especially they would do it when their career was set, when they'd had their family and all that. So when that is, it's like probably your 50s or 60s. Okay, and yeah, the American dream for them meant a middle-class lifestyle. In terms of the public sphere, millennials are pretty cynical, right? They sort of doubt whether, despite being social constructionists, right? So you think society's changeable, they sort of doubted anyone's power to actually change it. And so from a political point of view, they're a very inactive political generation, right? They just sort of sit there and take it in a lot of cases, right? Most of them are not particularly political. The rates of voting are relatively low. Few of them are really thinking about major cultural or ethical debates facing American or Canadian society. And if you ask them, what is the common good? Most of them are like, who dat? No, I'm kidding. But they just don't have a vocabulary of the common good, right? It's not something that philosophically has been talked about amongst millennials, right? And things like citizenship is not a word found on their tongues, in a sort of inversion of John F. Kennedy's famous phraseology, ask not what you can do for what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Millennials are like, ask not what you can do for your country, ask what your country can do for you, right? And so the state becomes very much a sort of means to an end of personal fulfillment. And yeah, I mean, they're sort of deeply immersed in their own personal lives. You know, what makes a person happy is family, friends, interesting acquaintances, associates, and experiences. And they start to navigate a lot of this and manage it through socials. All right, I have a little bit. I have 3 minutes. I promised I'd get through millennials, and I did. I'm definitely not getting through Gen Z, but we'll start. Okay, Gen Z, right? Who Twenge calls iGen for obvious reasons, because the internet and the iPhone are their dominant sort of technological reality. Okay, so the big and probably interesting thing about Gen Z, from like that technology the technology model of generations, is that the internet as a ubiquitous technology is what they've lived almost every day of their life, right? Whereas some millennials remember a time before the internet, Gen Z essentially doesn't, right? The internet has always been there as a major part of their lives and certainly a driving force of culture and pretty much everything they do. This is accelerated, right, particularly post-2007, when we get smartphones, right? So in 2007, Steve Jobs, walks onto the stage at Apple World, and he's like, one more thing. He introduces the iPhone, and in very, very short order, right? Within 5 years, the majority of Americans have a smartphone, which represents among the fastest adoptions of a new communication technology in human history, right? Compare that to the printing press, right? It took centuries for the printing press to fully sort of engulf society. The iPhone and smartphones do it in 5 to 10 years at the outside. So it's an incredibly quick adoption of technology. And as we'll kind of see as we go through the course, it's one that's incredibly fraught, right? Because the technology comes in so fast, the social norms don't keep up with it. Okay, so yeah, we get the iPhone, I come not to praise Steve Jobs, but to bury him. The evil men do lingers long after their death. It's the first smartphone targeted at consumers. Prior to that, we had Blackberries, but they were targeted at business people. And basically, the smartphone has become the defining technology for Gen Z. I don't have to tell you this because you all have one, and you probably spend more time with it than just about anything else in your lives, right? You sleep with it. It's with you every hour of every day. If you somehow don't know where it is, you probably get a little panicky. That's pretty normal. Okay, 1 minute? How does time go so fast? I don't know. All right, well, maybe, can I say these things in 1 minute? Well, I'll say the first one. Gen Z is our culmination, so far at least, of this trend towards greater and greater individualism that started with the baby boomers. And I guess we'll pick it up there because we're out of time. 3:50. My, how the time flies.